Hello again, BookTube. This is going to be another video about books which I read last year in 2024, but this time the focus is going to be on fiction. I've already made a Best Books of 2024 video in which I discussed the overall best books that I read last year, and this was actually a mixture of fiction and non-fiction. Now, I think a disadvantage of that, an obvious disadvantage of doing it that way, is that I missed out on mentioning so many wonderful fiction books that I read last year because I simply couldn't fit them onto the overall best books list. So this video should hopefully allow me to mention those fiction books which I wasn't able to mention in my overall top 10 books list. There was also a bias in that list towards non-fiction, because as time went on in the year, I was reading more and more non-fiction, and I think it just so happened that the non-fiction stuck out more in my mind than the fiction, because the fiction was stuff I had read earlier in the year. So to make up for that, I am here with a Best Fiction Books of 2024. And without further ado, we will start with the very first one, which has to be Middlemarch. I've already spoken about Middlemarch at length in other videos. If you've not read George Eliot's Middlemarch, it is an absolutely fantastic work. It is a superlative, superior, effortlessly grandiose, and simply magnificent work of fiction, and quite possibly the greatest novel ever written in the English language. It's between Middlemarch and James Joyce's Ulysses as to which book is the best, and I think that Middlemarch is easily one of the finest novels, if not the finest novel, written in the 19th century. And I believe that no bookshelf of any cultured person can be complete without this book in its collection. Middlemarch, just to recap very quickly, is the story of this fictional town in the centre of England, heavily modelled on Coventry, which is where George Eliot grew up, and it's about the lives of the inhabitants as they navigate the choppy waters of modernisation and industrialisation and societal shifts in terms of social reform, economic reform, electoral reform, and all of these different aspects of society in 19th century England, specifically the 1830s, and how this is affecting the people of that town. And there are those who embrace this change, there are those who welcome these transformations in everyday life, and there are those to whom this is threatening. And I think it's fair to say that most of the inhabitants find this to be threatening to their livelihoods and take a very conservative and even reactionary attitude to the social changes happening around them. And the story very much revolves around two main characters in particular who are very much idealists, who are running very much against the grain of the town in which they live. And we see these two idealists brought to very sticky situations and even tragedies as a result of their both bad luck but also mistakes that they make, because they are human. And Middlemarch is that quintessential book about real human beings making bad decisions, and those decisions coming back to bite them. And although the characters are fictional, they are very much characters that you can easily imagine, being real people. And that is what makes George Eliot's novel so fantastic. That, and also the magnificent prose that she writes in the novel. It is simply spellbinding to read. It is lush. It is poetic. It is also deeply philosophical and also deeply intellectual in its own way. And reading it, you can definitely see why Eliot was not only a great novelist, but was also considered to be one of the finest thinkers of her time. A woman steeped in German philosophy, Dutch philosophy, French philosophy, a woman who was steeped in ideas around political philosophy, around political economy, around religion. She was a brilliant mind, and I believe that she was the finest writer of the Victorian period. And so my list obviously is going to have Middlemarch as number one. I don't have it here with me because I plan on putting images of the books I talk about onto the video instead, with the exception of one book which I have here with me. But to save myself the trouble of dragging all the books up and down the stairs, I'm just going to put images of most of the books on this list. The next book I'm going to mention has to be East of Eden by John Steinbeck. East of Eden was a work I read at the very beginning of last year, and I loved it. I loved every moment I spent in this fictional world that John Steinbeck had created. I think that in many ways it's very similar to Middlemarch. It's a work of American realism, but set in the 20th century as opposed to the 19th. And it follows this family called the Trask family and another family called the Hamiltons, and how these two families interact with each other, but also with the world around them. And perhaps the most compelling aspect of the story has to be the way in which it retells the biblical story of Adam and Eve in both families, but more so in one of the families in particular, which is the Trask family. And we follow a man called Adam Trask, a rather hapless and weak-minded individual, who is nevertheless rather likable in his own way, despite his flaws. And we see his conflicts with his brother, Charles, who dies very young, but leaves behind a ticking time bomb in the form of a potentially illegitimate child of his, who is nevertheless officially supposed to be Adam's son. A son that he has, in theory, with his wife, a woman named Kathy, who abandons him and leads a rather sinister life, running a brothel in the city. Now, the ticking time bomb here is that Kathy's rather psychopathic nature is embedded in one of the two children that Adam has, and they effectively relive the conflict that Adam had with his own brother Charles in their own lives as they grow up. And we see these two children, Cal and Aaron, grow up, and we see the tension between them. We see the increasing viciousness of Cal as that psychopathic element that he inherited from his mother, Kathy, increasingly comes to light, and also quite possibly from his real father, Charles, because Adam very well may not in fact be his real father. And we see how this leads to very tragic conclusions for both children, and how Cal seeks passionately and sincerely to overcome this aspect of him that he has inherited from his mother. Now, I thought that the way in which the story was written was simply beautiful. I thought it was moving. I thought it was deeply engrossing. I believed that not only were the characters compelling, especially the character of Kathy, but I also thought that as a commentary on 20th century American society, it was mesmerizing and it was epic in its scale. The way in which it handled the transition from rural life, from agricultural life, to the life of the city, to the life of the automobiles and the massive factories and the increasingly elaborate world of trade and the world of mass production that was kicking off at that moment in time. I thought that that was very, very interesting and deeply engrossing to read. And I believed that the way in which Steinbeck writes about this period indicates his strong sympathy, I think, for people like Samuel Hamilton, people like his own family, who lived off the land, and who in some ways endured a harder life than people in the city. So I saw the portrayal of Samuel Hamilton as Steinbeck's way of romanticizing and paying tribute in his own way to this lost world of American agriculture. I also thought that the Chinese character, whose name I've frankly forgotten, Lee, I believe it was, I believe the way in which he was portrayed was in its own way deeply sympathetic, if somewhat of its time and somewhat dated. This is, after all, a book that was written many decades ago, I believe in the 1940s or 50s. I can't remember the exact year. But certainly it was actually much more sensitive than I thought it might be to the plight, you could say, of immigrants like Lee, who is Chinese American, and his family. And I believed that his character was a deeply interesting one, and one which actually played a very impactful role in his own right in the story. Although, of course, he was not the main attraction or even the main reason why I read the story. Now, as with any massive book, this is a fairly long novel. As with any long book, there were moments when my interest sagged a bit, especially in the middle. But I think that wading through the duller parts is worth it because I think that the ending is terrific. And I believe that this is one book which you have to have on your shelf. I believe that it is better than, easily superior to, the other work I've read by Steinbeck, which is Of Mice and Men, a book which I, along with many other British children, read for GCSE, which is our secondary school exams, end of secondary school exams that we have in this country. And Of Mice and Men, of course, is a very short book. It has its charms, but East of Eden is what you have to read if you want to get Steinbeck in his full glory. I still haven't read his other famous novel, The Grapes of Wrath, but that's the next Steinbeck book, which I would like to read. I don't know when I'll get round to that, but I certainly want to read that next, having had such a good time with East of Eden. So that is East of Eden by John Steinbeck. And next we have Dombey and Son, another book which I have already talked about at some length on this channel. I actually included this book as with Middlemarch in my best books of 2024. And Dombey and Son was quite possibly the best Dickens book I read last year. I read quite a few Dickens books last year. Most of them were disappointments, with the exception of Dombey and Son and Barnaby Rudge. So Dombey and Son was the book I enjoyed the most, I would say, out of all the Dickens books. It follows the story of Florence Dombey and her difficult relationship with her father, who despises her simply because she happens to be a woman. And it's about the attention and care which he lavishes on his son, who is his favourite, and whom he hopes will succeed him in the family business. And we see how the relationship between this man and his daughter deteriorates further when his son dies young, as a result of which his resentment towards the daughter for having the temerity to remain alive whilst his son is dead only deepens and only further causes distance between them. And there is a happy ending. There is a reconciliation of sorts at the end of the story, but it is a very moving and a very elaborate, I think, story, and one which Dickens put a lot of work into, I think. One which contains perhaps his best writing, or some of his best writing, I should say, and actually a work which I believe is highly overrated. I'm sorry, not overrated, underrated. I meant to say a work which is highly underrated in the Dickens canon, and I wish more people read it. I wish more people knew of it. It's the book before he wrote David Copperfield, but I think it is easily a superior book to David Copperfield, and also one which has one of the best villains, I think, that Dickens ever wrote for any of his novels. I still haven't finished my journey of reading Dickens in chronological order. I have recently finished Bleak House, so I will read whichever book he wrote after Bleak House. I can't remember which book that is, but whichever book that is the Dickens book I will read next. But Dombey and Son is a very, very good read from the oeuvre of Charles Dickens, and one which I highly recommend, having had a great time with it last year. The next book, which I will be mentioning, is Return of the Native by Thomas Hardy. Now, this was a book which I greatly enjoyed reading during the spring of last year. We follow a man called Clym Yeobright, who is the main character of the story, although in some ways he isn't the main character. In some ways, the main character is another character who I will mention in a bit. But Clym Yeobright is this young man from the countryside. He's from this fictional English village called Egdon Heath, which is this very dark, gloomy, forbidding part of the English countryside that is based strongly on a part of Dorset that Hardy knew very well when he was a young man. But this fictional area of Egdon Heath is the backdrop to this rather intricate and elaborate story of the doomed romance between Clym Yeobright and a woman called Eustacia Vi. Now, Clym Yeobright has come back from many years spent in Paris, where he was actually training to become a jeweler. But he's decided that this rather luxurious lifestyle of upper-class decadence isn't for him, and that he would rather go back to living a humble life in Egdon Heath as a schoolteacher. Now, coming back to Egdon Heath, he meets this woman called Eustacia Vi, a woman who is perhaps one of the most compelling character, I think, in the story. More compelling, I think, than Clym. And she longs to escape Egdon Heath, which she sees as a prison, and go off to a more exciting life, ideally abroad. And she sees in Clym Yeobright a man who is upwardly mobile, a man who at some point sought to better himself, who sought to escape from the English countryside and become a successful man of business abroad. And she hopes that in marrying Clym, he will take her out of the desolation of Egdon Heath to a more exciting life outside this rather dark and forbidding environment in which she finds herself. Unfortunately for her, it turns out that Clym actually has other plans. He wants to settle down and go back to his humble life, go back to his roots in the countryside, and this luxurious lifestyle that Eustacia is dreaming of is not to his liking. It's a world which he was part of briefly, and which he subsequently abandoned and decided was not to his liking. Now, this leads predictably to the disintegration of their relationship, but we also see, as part of this rather elaborate story, a disastrous marriage between his cousin Thomasin and a man called Damon Wildeve, who later goes on to have an affair with Eustacia Vi, and this only adds more complication to what is already a rather complicated story. I should also mention the character of Diggory Venn, who was a very fun character to get to know in that story, who is actually secretly in love with Thomasin. And that, of course, only adds to the confusion and the complexity of this rather intricate love story that we see in Return of the Native. Now, Hardy tends to over-rely, I think, on these rather elaborate love triangles and even love squares or love circles, you could call them. And it does actually come across as cliche a lot of the time. But I think the way in which he handles it in Return of the Native is done effectively, and it is actually done for a rather serious social purpose. It's not just to entertain, but he's also trying in his own way to make a commentary on marriage and on society and on the hypocrisy, as he saw it, of upper class Victorian society. And Hardy struggled actually in his own life with this conflict between his roots in the countryside, his roots as someone from a working class background, but also his desire for social acceptance by the upper class literary elites that he met in London. And so his resentment at those elites, whom he always felt never fully accepted him as one of them, is something which we see being expressed in his stories. And Clym Yeobright as a character is very much based on Hardy. I really enjoyed Return of the Native. It was probably the Hardy novel I enjoyed the most in that year. Despite its flaws and despite the rather long exposition, which it takes up, I think, a third of the book, it is well worth your while reading, and I think that the rather crushing end of the story is definitely one of the best tragic endings that Hardy ever wrote to any of his novels. Moving on from Return of the Native, we have The Woodlanders, also by Thomas Hardy, which has a very similar plot to Return of the Native. Again, we have a character who is caught between their roots in the countryside, their roots in a more working class background, and their desire for a more upper class life. And the character of Grace Melbury is a case in point. So Grace Melbury starts off the story supposed to marry a man called Giles Winterbourne, who is from a rather rural, agricultural, working class background, much like herself. But she decides, or rather her father decides for her, that actually, after all those years that she has actually spent in school studying how to be a lady, that she isn't actually good enough. Or rather, I should rephrase that. Giles Winterbourne isn't good enough for her, and that she is actually uh, much better placed to marry someone else. So she ends up marrying another man who turns out not to be so well suited for her, and comes to bitterly regret rejecting Giles Winterbourne. But of course, at that point, it's far too late, and the story unfolds from there. Not only that, but we also have, again, as we often do with these Hardy novels, an example of unrequited love in the form of a woman called Marty South, who is secretly in love with Giles Winterbourne, even though Giles is interested in Grace. And that, of course, only adds to the complication, shall we say, of that particular plot. But The Woodlanders is a book I really enjoyed. The film I watched with Rufus Sewell isn't as good, I thought. But The Woodlanders is another Thomas Hardy book, which I think is well worth a read if you get the chance to read it. And lastly, we have The Brothers Karamazov by Dostoevsky, and the translation by Michael Katz. I believed that the Katz translation, which is the most recent translation of the book, was superb. I really enjoyed reading it. I thought that the way in which it handles the nuances and the complexities of Dostoevsky's prose was masterful. Definitely, if you compare it to the other popular English translation of Dostoevsky by Constance Garnett, you'll find that Garnett's prose and her way of rendering Dostoevsky is much clunkier and much less, I think, artful than the way in which Katz is able to do it. and I believed for so long that Garnett was the gold standard in terms of English translation of Dostoevsky, and I still really enjoy her translations. But having read many other translations since then, I have, of course, come to reevaluate the quality of those translations, and Katz's translation is perhaps the translation that has given me the most serious reconsideration of that particular translation. I really enjoyed Avcii's translation as well when I read that a while ago, but I would say that the Brothers Karamazov translation by Katz surpasses it in the sense that even though I read both of them in the same year. So I read the Avcii translation last year, several months before reading the Katz translation, and I would say that Avcii's translation, although it's a very fun translation and is very modern actually in the way it translates Dostoevsky, errs on the side of being too modern, I think, and does so in a way which is a bit distracting. Whereas I think Katz does it in a much more nuanced way, and in a way that's less jarring. So I believe that if you want something that sounds really modern and really contemporary, then Avcii is your best bet. If you want something that's a bit more accurate, I would say that Katz is perhaps your best bet. And I believe the way in which Katz translates the book is much better, I think, than the way Pavia and Volokhonsky do it, which is a translation which I think is rather stilted in the way in which it renders Dostoevsky. And I believe that Katz has a wonderful balance between something which is both accurate and yet also very readable as well, and makes sense in English, and also avoids being overly modern in the way that Avcii is. Now, coming in at number 7, in terms of best books I read last year for fiction, I have to mention Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte. That, in my view, timeless story of the doomed love between Cathy on the one hand and Heathcliff on the other will quite simply never get old for me. Not only is the prose spectacular and deeply poetic, but I also think that the character of Heathcliff remains for me one of the most compelling villains in all of English literature. And it had been a while since I read it. I recently went and saw a play about the lives of the Bronte sisters in London, and whilst I was there, I actually purchased a Penguin English Library edition of Wuthering Heights, which I decided I would use as my replacement for my old Wordsworth copy, which is rather battered now. So I read the book recently, reread it as part of my fiction reading of last year, and I had a blast. I really enjoyed reliving my time in the world of Wuthering Heights, and I believe it was my third reading of the novel. So that goes to show just how much I adore Emily Bronte and her powerful and, I would say, also deeply mesmerizing and moving novel. Number 8, I have to mention Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. It's a book I've read before, although it had been a while since I read it. And so last year I read it again, reread it for a second time. And the marvelous world of Jane Austen just came bustling back into my consciousness. And it was wonderful meeting all of these magnificent characters that she brings to life in such a vivid way in the story. Mr. Darcy was his usual proud, arrogant, cold self, although I think I understand him a lot more than I did on a first reading. I believe that the character of Eliza Bennet was, as ever, incredibly sympathetic in her own way, but also very frustrating at times. I believed that Mr. Collins was the same bumbling fool that he always is in the story, and that was deeply amusing to me. I believed that the way in which this story is crafted is quite simply first-rate. It's so organic in the way it flows and the way in which the misunderstandings of the first part of the novel are resolved. And I just thought it was a wonderful, cheerful, lovely bit of summer reading, which put me in a very good mood. So that was nice to read. Number 9, I would mention Master and Margarita, the famous work by Bulgakov, which I read for the first time last year, in which the devil comes to Moscow, pays a visit to Moscow, and brings about chaos. And it was a terrifically exciting read. It was wonderful to see the way in which Bulgakov mercilessly mocks and satirizes the Soviet system and the absurdities it involves. The black comedy in the novel is terrific. My favorite part of the story was probably when I've forgotten her name. The main female character, I believe, in the story. I believe she is the lover of the master, actually. The part where she was flying around Moscow on a broomstick and smashing up the windows of the apartment building. I thought that was terrific reading. It was deeply entertaining, and it was wonderful to see the way in which Bulgakov set an entire social system alight, effectively, with the power of comedy, with the power of ridicule. And I believe that if you're ever in doubt as to whether or not there is a place for that sort of thing in literature, The Master and Margarita will absolve you of any notion that comedy does not have a role to play in deflating and challenging absurdities in society. So Master and Margarita by Bulgakov comes in at number 9. And lastly, I would mention Barnaby Rudge by Charles Dickens. Now, this was a surprise. I read this as my first Dickens novel in quite a while. Ever since I DNF'd the old Curiosity Shop, I hadn't picked up any more Dickens. So this was quite a surprise for me. I wasn't expecting to enjoy it as much as I did, but I did. Barnaby Rudge is the story, effectively, a retelling, effectively, of the Gordon riots of the 1780s. And it involves a whole host of interesting characters, all fictional, of course, except for the famous character of Lord George Gordon, the cause of the riots in the first place. But I had great fun reading the story. A lot of the book is, of course, taken up with retelling the riots, and it did go on for quite a bit, this retelling of the riots, but I nevertheless enjoyed the book on the whole. I did think that the way in which the character of Dolly Varden is talked about and treated was a bit creepy, but that is standard Dickens for you. And there was also a wonderful Romeo and Juliet style love story embedded in the story, which was resolved very nicely and not at all like the original story is. It ended happily, and I believe in a way that was a bit cliche, but nevertheless it was heartwarming, I suppose, and somewhat cheering. So that was a very surprising, actually, and very enjoyable read, I must say. The character of Sim Tapetit, I believe it was, or Simon Tapetit, however his name is said or pronounced. Well, he was a deeply compelling character, a villainous character, certainly, very villainous, but definitely a compelling character, and a character I wish there'd been more of, actually, in the story. And I believe overall it was a very good read. So Barnaby Rudge by Charles Dickens, I think one of his more underrated novels, much like Dombey and Son. If you've not read it, I highly recommend. So that is it in terms of the 10 best works of fiction I read last year. And I think I will leave it there. Feel free, of course, to comment in the comment section below and ask me for further thoughts and opinions on other works if you want to hear about them. And I will do my best to be of service. Signing off for now, BookTube.